Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. So just a heads up, I really wanted to record this in our bedroom today in a little bit of a nest. It's raining, but Honey's here snoring in the background. And often that happens and I try to cover it up or fix it somehow. But today I'm just going to call it out and let it happen. Honey may be snoring in the background. There may be other noises. And it feels good to normalize that for others and for myself, that it's okay to do really good work that you love, even if it's not totally perfect. So I really love this, being in my room, laying on my side, being super comfortable right now, and getting to share with you this topic that I hope will be really helpful. It comes under our healing part of the functional spirituality method and has a bit of heaviness to it. And it's this experience of being trapped in a toxic relationship. And what I want to do today is to reframe what it means to experience being trapped in a toxic relationship. So right away, I'll give a disclaimer that, and I'm going to give this disclaimer many times, and it's what this episode is about, that I am not in a toxic relationship, and I also don't believe that my partner is toxic. And this is what I want to talk about, is that we can feel a lot of pain. We can feel trapped. We can feel some of the darkest emotions and wounds and suffering in our relationships, whether they are intimate relationships with our significant other, or whether they are work relationships, friend relationships, or just relationships with anyone. It can really bring out the darkest parts of our experience. And then we might label those experiences or those people as toxic. And what I want to do today is to unpack that label. So I don't think it's beneficial to label something as toxic. I think it's important to be able to understand why and how something feels toxic. So, I know even if my partner is to listen to this, which he probably will, sometimes he does, people and other people, they might take this on face value, that I'm saying that I was innocent, I'm innocent, other people are toxic, and that's what the toxic relationship means. And, people take just the names of the podcast on face value and assume something and have entire opinions and stories about what I mean and what the, facts are of things just from the title of a podcast. So even in this podcast where I'll be explaining things, hopefully I'll be able to share what I'm really trying to get across. And one thing I'm trying to get across is that when something hurts us, there's a part of our brain that blames. And we live in a culture where we believe that part. And, a lot of spiritual teachers are talking about the mind, they demonize the mind, the mind's not true, get away from the mind. If only you could turn your mind off, then you'd be happy. And it's not the mind, it's that, our brain produces different parts of our mind. And one part of our mind, one function of our brain, it's to find something to blame. Another part is always looking for solutions. And we need to develop an inner culture and, a new culture where we don't automatically believe the part that blames, and that we follow the other mental activity that is sometimes more helpful, which is to be objective and to look at and analyze the situation. So not to jump to assumptions and conclusions about, this, whatever your brain throws up as the cause, the blame, not to just believe that, and to also think that and unconsciously assume, it's all unconscious, we assume that blaming is the solution. But actually the solution in a lot of cases is to analyze what the dynamic is. So for me, my definition and what I want to share today is that, to me, a toxic relationship, it's a dynamic. So there's no cause, or there is a cause, but there's no one to blame. A toxic relationship is a dynamic that brings out unhealthy and unchosen pieces and patterns of ourselves. So, there are relationships that bring out the best in us, and there are relationships that bring out the worst in us. And, it's like you could be with the most amazing, beautiful person, but the dynamic, the way that we relate to each other is somehow bringing out unhealthy and unchosen pieces and patterns. So I know we might want to be able to label someone as toxic, as if they are always negative, or, someone that we find is very often negative or rude or aggressive, and then we could just label that person as toxic. But they're just expressing those unhealthy, unchosen pieces that we all have more readily. But everyone is able to be soothed if they receive what they need. Everyone has those better, more healthy pieces that could be expressed. So it's not, people aren't toxic, but the way that we relate to each other can be toxic. And to me, a toxic dynamic is when you aren't receiving what you need. And, if we all have very deep, old needs that have been so underfulfilled that it's actually turned into a wound. So a wound meaning something that hurts. And if we're engaged in a dynamic where this is so unconscious, that's why it's not really seen for what it is. But if we're in a relationship or in a dynamic where we're not getting our need met, and one of our wounds is being aggravated and it's painful, then that relationship is toxic. By a definition, where it's toxic because it's perpetuating unharmonious, unhealthy, painful experiences for us that are not either keeping us neutral or moving us forward to more harmony, healing, presence, love, all of the whatever individual aspirations we have. So if it's something that's it's taking us in the opposite direction to what we most want to cultivate, and it's creating more dysfunction than harmony or even neutrality, then it would be toxic. So the relationship isn't serving our best interests or our values or our health and our harmony, even on just a purely biological, objective level. It's not serving us to be harmonious. So how do you know that you're in a toxic relationship? So, whatever reasons, we'll often think about the story. It's all of these reasons. You did this, I wanted that. But that's not what we're looking at to define what makes it toxic. That's just part of the story. And the story can change depending on, the depth of our thinking and the different relationships. Maybe the stories are quite similar, and then you're kind of getting to something a little bit deeper, the wound, the actual wound that you might have that keeps getting triggered. But even then, it can still be like a surface story. So the deeper reasons of what define a relationship as toxic, think about these. So the first one for me is that you hate being in it. You hate being, sometimes, not all the time, right? But sometimes you just hate being in that relationship, and you hate that dynamic. You wish you weren't in it so bad. And also you feel trapped somehow, like you can't get out of it. So there's a sense of powerlessness. And you also feel deep wounds are being aggravated, and it feels painful. And also a feeling of hopelessness. So the most painful human emotion that we can experience, where there's a shutting down of our system so much. In words, as adults, we could say something like it's a feeling of losing the will to be engaged with our life. So feeling hopeless, feeling depressed, having our hope and our engagement for life being depressed. So if you're feeling, those things are all pretty toxic. So if in your relationship, it's surfacing and causing these kinds of emotions, then you could probably say that the relationship is toxic to some degree. And again, just going back to the culture around this word of toxic relationships. So right away, it's like, oh, well, this person must be terrible. And oh my God, I need to get out of it. Actually, we don't need to jump to any of those conclusions. The point of this episode, and then the point of healing, or the ingredients to healing, is the first ingredient to healing is objectivity and psychoeducation, to see what is happening, to see it from a new light, not to see it from the perspective of the wounded, regressed pieces or the child parts of us. That's the first step, is to look at it from a different perspective right away. That brings objectivity, hopefulness, clarity, empowerment, when we can see our triggers in a way that brings more power and hopefulness and clarity. So another reason that all of these are signifiers of a toxic relationship is that it means that this relationship is triggering the deepest root causes of our trauma, or the deepest traumas that we have as humans, and exemplifies or reminds us of the most traumatic experiences we've ever had, which would be at our most vulnerable times in our developmental years, when we were periods when we felt most vulnerable, most helpless, the most pain, the most hopelessness, the most shutting down and depressing of ourselves, and the lack of feeling like there's any hope or any power, or any hope that things would change. Not knowing how to change, not having the strength or the knowledge or the empowerment to change it, to feel trapped. And a lot of those wounds and fragments, those pieces inside of us, of course, they're still there. And then some dynamics, some relationships trigger that. So they're triggering the deepest wounds that we have, the different flavors of how we have these wounded pieces inside and these fragments that have not yet been integrated. And if a certain relationship is triggering that, and it's triggering it repeatedly, and we're not able to get on top of it, then it becomes toxic, because it's just reminding us and reinvigorating that experience. It's reinvigorating that wound and that issue that we have inside, and we're not able to get on top of it, either personally with ourselves or in the dynamic. We're not able to manifest the change that we need. We're not able to manifest the safety, the healing, whatever, just the space where that wound isn't being triggered. That wound from the past, this same experience from the past is getting triggered, then it's toxic, because it's not just a lot of relationships can just be neutral. It doesn't really trigger anything in you, but this is actually bringing up pain from the past and making it hurt us now. So it's not just reminding us of the past, it's actually using the pain from the past to hurt us now. So remember, it's the dynamic. It's not the person. It's how we are showing up in the relationship that is hurting us. It's us. It's our pieces that are showing up and present in the relationship. And then the dynamic of how we relate to each other that continues to trigger it. Yeah, so a little bit more about, for me, my experience of this was just this week, just feeling the pain of being in toxic relationships. So many of my relationships have had all of these qualities that I hated being in it at periods. I felt trapped. I wasn't able to leave or fix things, felt hopeless, powerless, had deep, deep wounds that felt so painful, and I felt depressed. And, I'm in this very connected and internal and focused place at the moment in my life where I'm really connecting into the pain that I have felt, and different things can trigger and remind me of the pain that's still living in my body. And that was what came up for me this week, was feeling the pain of being in a toxic relationship, and then feeling the particular wounds of mine that, were perpetuated and aggravated, that define that relationship as toxic. So feeling into those wounds that I have and just kind of processing them. And they are so heavy that it can bring a lot of sadness and a lot of exhaustion. But there's always going to be tools to work through this. So what do we do? The first thing is to not just label the relationship or the wounds or the person as toxic, but try to understand what is creating this pain for me. And like I said, this comes under the healing part of the functional spirituality method. So it's this whole part of our spiritual practice that has to do with healing and resolving these unprocessed conditions inside. And the first ingredient to healing, according to functional spirituality, is psychoeducation. So gaining an understanding of why certain things hurt. How do we lose our freedom to choose our thoughts and behaviors? What decreases the capacity of our nervous system to relate? So that psychoeducation piece, something that brings objectivity and a framework for healing, is always going to be the first step. So, listening to episodes like this and, repeating it and using it as a way of understanding yourself. I think on our free resources page, there's a whole category that's all about relationships. So understanding more about relating and about healing. And that's so often missing, right? Is like a really clear, grounded framework for why, again, our nervous system's capacity to relate has been decreased, how we've lost our freedom and why certain things hurt. That's so important and so often missing. And then, of course, different tools and studies, like learning about communication and boundaries, studying the dynamic, and then studying ourselves in order to break free from these patterns, to get on top of these patterns, where blaming is kind of like staying on the same level of the patterns. And yeah, I think I have just come to a halt. I don't have anything further to say on this. Feels relevant to just kind of take a big breath and to feel the trust and the hope that all of this is manageable. We can get on top of it. We can absolutely move into an upward spiral of healing instead of that downward spiral of less and less capacity, more and more stress. So I hope this episode has supported you to feel a bit more hopeful. I mean, that's the main point of the episodes on functional spirituality that are about deconditioning and healing. It's to bring that framework and to bring more hopefulness that there is definitely a path forward out of those toxic relationships. And my process this week was processing some of that lingering pain from being in toxic relationship, but it prompted me to share this kind of reframing that I think is really necessary. So let us know what your thoughts are on the podcast. As always, we love hearing your feedback in our group. And thanks again for listening. If you haven't noticed, we're doing just one podcast a week. So 1 week is a meditation and then the next one is a talk. So if you've enjoyed this, definitely share the link with a friend or screenshot it and share it on socials. All of that is super, super helpful for us to support us in this offering. So I will speak to you again in 2 weeks.
Thank you for tuning in to the Functional Spirituality Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you subscribe by pressing the plus button on iTunes or the following button on Spotify. This is going to ensure that this resource is available and top of mind when you most need it. So please subscribe now.